The Russia-Ukraine ceasefire dilemma has been playing out very much as expected. Russia's President Putin has found himself in a tactical grey area, requiring all his skill and cunning. He is weighing up which he values the most. Either his current momentum on the battlefield in Ukraine, along with his desire to achieve his maximalist goals there, versus the reality that the Trump administration's strong realignment in his favour presents opportunities beyond Ukraine that will still be worth grasping. Made all the more complicated by Trump's inherent unpredictability and thin skin. So what we're seeing is Putin and his spokesman being very flattering and positive towards President Trump, cautiously optimistic about the prospects for his ceasefire, but in solidarity with Mr. Trump on Ukraine. But the idea in itself is correct and we support it unconditionally. But there have been a number of buts introduced, and we'll talk about those in a minute. Some of them are negotiable. Putin is doing three things right now. It's a delicate balancing act. Firstly, he is buying a bit more time. He really wants to wipe Ukraine's soldiers out of the Russia-Kursk region before the borders get frozen by a ceasefire. Ukraine wants to be able to trade Russian land off for Ukrainian, but Putin's forces are very close to success there, so even a short delay can deny Ukraine that bargaining chip. Second, he's trying to flatter and to be positive towards Trump. If he loses US support, well, okay, he's back to where he was before. But if there's a way of doing this that makes Trump feel validated, then there could be more benefits down the line for him and for Russia. But equally, Putin is only respected by Trump because he is a powerful and deliberate player on the world stage. So his making Trump feel validated is not going to take the form of the obsequious parade we've seen going through the White House, leaders going on and on about how wonderful and wise President Trump is in exchange for not being humiliated by him in front of the world. And besides, Putin is not served by this proposed time-limited ceasefire. Unlike the unlimited ceasefire the Russians and US team discussed at Riyadh, it doesn't enable him to demand that Ukraine holds elections. Now, it's possible that Zelensky's boosted popularity after the Oval Office meltdown has dented his previously reported conviction that Zelensky would lose such an election. So, Putin's gamble, in search of his third objective, is to seek to manipulate Trump just a bit to advance a couple of his additional demands. He'll be expecting to lose one or two of those demands to persuade Trump that he's a great negotiator. Now that's a picture crying out for a caption competition, if you ask me. Indeed, just before shooting this video, President Trump offered up a concession that Putin can supposedly make that he knows actually doesn't impinge on his goals at all. Trump noted that Ukrainian soldiers are in a bad position in Kursk and said that he had asked Putin to spare their lives. While Putin loses little by acceding to that request, gains leverage for his real objectives, namely this: he wants to maximise the benefit to Russia and minimise the benefit to Ukraine from any ceasefire. So, for instance, he argued for a condition that Ukraine not be allowed to rearm during the ceasefire, at least not to receive military aid from US or European supporters. This would be an extremely unequal benefit, because Russia will be continuing to rearm its own forces at full speed. He doesn't want Europe involved in negotiations. If a ceasefire happens before Kursk has been cleared, he doesn't want it to apply to Kursk, and so on. Oh, and Putin doesn't want Trump's Ukraine envoy, General Kellogg, involved. That one has already been agreed by the White House. You might argue, why would Trump agree such conditions? And the answer again is because this is a negotiation between Putin and Trump, Russia and America, about what they will do for each other and to meet their respective objectives in the world more widely. Putin understands this is a wider discussion. As I keep saying, Ukraine is a piece on the board, it's not the objective of the chess game. He also understands Trump wants to stay on Russia's side, so he's more likely to embrace options that Putin gives him to do so long as he doesn't push it too far. As you would expect, Ukraine has dismissed Russia's response and tried to frame its response in a way that will be most likely to encourage America to see it for what it is and not to fall for Putin's moves. Having come to an agreement with the US, Zelensky is trying to leverage that to the maximum extent he possibly can to win the US side over to his view of what Putin is up to. European countries are also keen for that to happen. I had to chuckle today when it was reported that a security services source for a European nation had told The Telegraph that the security community believes that Putin sees Trump as being weak and easily manipulated. Well, sure, it's not as though that's a huge hidden secret that only those in the know might have sniffed out for themselves. I mean, they could have gotten that revelation by, I don't know, watching a video on this channel, for instance. But of course, by doing it this way, getting it into the media, they hope that suggestion makes its way to President Trump's eyes and ears. Shockingly, there's no evidence Trump watches this channel. I know, I don't understand it either. But anyway, if it makes its way to Trump, then they hope he will be more likely to want to prove it wrong. Which, of course, is another way of trying to manipulate him. Hampered by the fact that Trump respects Putin on the principle that power recognizes power, and right now he doesn't extend that respect much to Europe. Still, worth a try from their point of view. In the short term, Trump's desire to be persuaded by Putin is kind of in plain sight. In response to Putin's statements, Trump described them as very promising, but incomplete. I think we all know that had it been Ukraine responding, those would not have been the words that Trump would be using about them. In response to the suggestion that the two leaders would have a direct discussion, he said this: "I'd love to meet with him and talk to him, but we have to get it over with fast." And that's the negotiating ground right there. Trump wants fast movement. Putin wants slow. Putin will demand concessions for the fast movement. The question will be, what can Trump give him that he is confident he can then force the Ukrainians to accept? Ukraine will see this as a moment of danger. They are pitching to the US to accept them as being the side to support, in spite of the hostility towards them that Trump's base now has. On their side, Trump is kind of indifferent to what his base wants him to do. But the Ukrainians will know that Trump is also perfectly likely to accept Russia's counterbid of a highly conditional, unconditional ceasefire. And then Ukraine will be back on the back foot, trying to dig its way out of another trap. One thing Putin won't move on is Russia's strong alliance with China. That point was underlined today as China and Russia held a summit with Iran to discuss the prospect of a new nuclear deal. That summit concluded with all three countries joining together to condemn US threats and sanctions against Iran and calling instead for diplomacy. Iran has rapidly expanded its stock of near-bomb-grade uranium since Trump ended the previous Iran nuclear deal back in 2018. Experts suggest that it would now take them less than a week to enrich enough material to make a nuclear bomb. Now, Iran, of course, denies that it wants a nuclear bomb. Presumably, they made a very serious pinky promise that everyone can believe. This week, a letter was delivered to Tehran from President Trump, the contents of which haven't been made public. But earlier, Trump had said that Iran should make a deal or else. So I think we get the general idea. Iran is not remotely attracted by the prospect of such a negotiation. Sanam Vakil of the UK's Chatham House said that trust in the Trump administration is in very short supply in Tehran following the humiliation of President Zelensky in the Oval Office, along with the extreme Gaza proposal. But of course, Iran is also considerably weakened right now, so how it plays its hand isn't necessarily as strong as it would want it to be. Having China and Russia alongside you is therefore pretty important to it. And it's an indicator. Putin may indulge a new hobby of flattering Trump for fun and profit, but the original serious purpose of building an alternative world order at the expense of the United States, that remains the mission. It's just that, it becomes easier if Trump destroys American alliances, appoints Russian sympathizers to key positions over his security apparatus, and discards all of its carefully built-up soft power initiatives from the last 80 years. Why would you not want to encourage more of that if you were Vladimir Putin? Well, the answer is that Putin almost certainly knows that Trump is likely to be unreliable to Russia, since it has been nothing but unreliable to everyone else for the last few weeks. So he will hold on to the achievement of his concrete objectives more tightly than he will the possible promise of jam tomorrow with a pliant United States. In the meantime, those spurned allies continue to flatter Trump in their unique, obsequious, cringe-worthy way, trying desperately to keep the old order together. So this week it was the turn of NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte, who did the obligatory praise heaping onto Trump in front of the American media. Trump had revitalized NATO, he said. Referring to the coming NATO summit in June, he said this: "I really want to work together with you in the run-up to the Hague summit to make sure that we will have a NATO which is really reinvigorated under your leadership, and we are getting there." Loosely translated as, please don't pull out of NATO, not until we're ready. The conceit is that Europe is rearming now, inspired by President Trump's demands, and this makes them worthy allies of his again. They're really all just his friends. The truth is, more to be seen by the news today that Portugal, one of those countries, has announced that it is pulling out of the purchase of American F-35 fighter jets. It will instead be looking to buy European planes. The outgoing defence minister said that the US just wasn't a predictable ally anymore. And of course this is exactly what we said was going to happen with the European boost in defence spending. Lead times for such weapon systems are very long. Operation of many US systems requires ongoing US cooperation to make them work. All those people celebrating Trump throwing his weight around with his allies, they ignore the point, again, that actions have consequences, and they get annoyed and scandalised when those consequences come into view. But the idea that you can run around making bold actions with zero such consequences, that is the existential theory of children at play. In any case, how long Mark Rutte and NATO can hold it all together, flattering Trump and hoping he doesn't notice or care too much about the obvious signs that he is seen as much of a threat to Europe now as anyone else, and they're building up their defences against him as much as they are against Vladimir Putin, well, that remains to be seen. NATO's Rutte also dodged a question about Greenland. There's not much he could have said on the subject that wouldn't have sent the moment into the dreaded downward spiral, such as we saw in the Oval Office meltdown. But of course the repeated threats by Trump that one way or another, in spite of the expressed wishes of its population, the US would get Greenland, currently part of another NATO member, Denmark, that would be a huge rift within NATO were it to happen. Rutte's calculation was, well, why let it turn into a disastrous argument when it's probably not going to happen anyway, or at least, why cross the bridge until you come to it? Right now, all of it centres on flattering the fragile ego in the White House. Putin is doing it, and he's using skills he's honed over decades to do so effectively. NATO is doing it from a position of weakness. Zelensky is doing it from a position of desperation on behalf of his country. Iran is seeking to avoid doing it, as most countries where saving face is a huge deal will be inclined to do, unless they have no choice. The whole world is now weighing up pragmatic national interest versus the humiliating ritual of paying obeisance to the American leaders, preempting their crass demands that everyone should be grateful to them over and over again for whatever it is they chose to bestow on them. The man they're trying to manage thrives on being at the centre of dramatic headlines, which makes the mating dance they're performing an particularly hazardous one. In the meantime, there's still a war on, and what happens next obviously matters a lot.